Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. Autistic clinicians have long hid their diagnosis from colleagues, but some are beginning to share their stories to ignite change. We'll read the rest of this later, but for now, let's skip to the end. A doctor approached Javed after seeing her in a televised appearance on the BBC. The doctor had recently received an autism diagnosis and was struggling to come to terms with it. They said that they felt internally or permanently broken, she says, but hearing my diagnosis, it gave them confidence and courage that there are possibilities. That excerpt from a Spectrum News article, at least to me, sounds like an emotional account of a person coming to terms with being clinically diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And how did Dr. Lee Wachtel, a board member on the National Council on Severe Autism, respond to this article on the official NCSA podcast?
It's become sadly almost like faddish for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic.
Huh?
Autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift, it's special to be this way. And, you bring something special and unique to the world that other people don't have. And it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent. And it seems that a lot of people, rather than perhaps looking more deeply at the crux of the issues that they're experiencing, have happily taken on this moniker of autism. Have happily taken on this moniker of autism. Have happily taken on this moniker of autism.
Dr. Wachtel, the article says they felt internally or permanently broken upon receiving this diagnosis and needed support from people with similar struggles to even begin to cope with it. That's not a person happily taking on the moniker of autism, Dr. Wachtel. That's a person struggling to find hope that they might have a future worth living for. But I'll happily take on the challenge of exposing how severely messed up the National Council on Severe Autism is in regards to their sincerely outrageous bias against autistic people speaking out for themselves and attempting to work their way into respected career fields where they sometimes aren't welcome due to ongoing societal stigma. This task will not only require extreme excess of free time, but incredible attention to detail. Well, good thing I'm an autistic furry. Welcome to Part 1 of Barrier Aggression, my critical analysis of select material from the National Council on Severe Autism's official podcast, in which I find myself right off the bat in a perplexing state of affairs where someone titled this video, "Dog with Autism Stands Up Against Karens," in spite of the fact that not only are none of these humans named Karen, but I am not a dog. Unless they prove themselves to be disrespectful in some way, there's no reason at this point to call Jill Escher, Dr. Lee Wachtel, or Dr. Carmen Lopez Arvizu names they don't even go by, because that's disrespectful. You know what else would be disrespectful? Saying that which is not about disabled people, which one would hope that these three, as panelists on a podcast about standing up for disabled people, would never do. And who am I? My name is Super Train Station H, but just H will do it fine. And what am I? I am a Lunarian, whose ancestors migrated to Earth from the life-bearing moon of a parallel universe to live among humans. That being said, I'm just a person like any other living on the Earth of Redemption Center 5. In my personal life, I'm a logistical librarian that drives trains on the Ocean Library Beach Railway between Hartside and Hamels in Rockaway, New York City. And in my free time, I perform for my tiny little audience of regulars on YouTube and on Twitch, where I'm known as a gamer, writer, and poet. But I was a student once upon a time, and I was diagnosed with several learning disabilities, motor control disabilities, and neurodevelopmental disabilities, many of which fall under what is now known as autism spectrum disorder. I personally try not to make these things the defining characteristics of who I am, but it's also true that whether or not I personally describe myself as autistic or disclose those details about myself to others, My life experience is partially formed by those things, including many years where I had to advocate for myself against biased authorities who insisted that I was undeserving of respect in my attempts to participate in society. While some critics of the autistic self-advocacy movement, like the US-based National Council on Severe Autism, published messages implying that there's an ongoing problem with autism self-advocates who are actually perfectly functional people who don't even have learning disabilities, but are proclaiming themselves in bad faith to be autistic as grounds to subject parents and caretakers of severely autistic people to unhinged vitriolic hatred for the crime of just communicating the realities faced by their loved ones and patients, there's a bit more than that going on.
All we're doing is communicating their reality. Like, it's inherently awful. Like, their existence is inherently awful to these people. And
to any reasonable person, that would sound like a serious problem that needs to be stopped immediately. Just the same, any reasonable person would stop and ask what the heck is actually going on if they were to learn that some of the critics making these accusations against autistic self-advocates have a definition of being perfectly functional that includes people who have professionally documented functional impairments. Just as any reasonable person would want to ask further questions upon learning that some of these critics may have a definition of not having learning disabilities that potentially includes people who have formally documented learning disabilities. And any reasonable person might scratch their head upon hearing that many of these people have a definition of facetious self-diagnosis of autism that includes people who are diagnosed in a clinical setting. So, what the heck is actually going on? Well, the fifth major edition of the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, went into effect in 2013. At that point, several neurodevelopmental disorders, which had long been considered to be closely related, one of which was called autism disorder, were grouped together into what is now called autism spectrum disorder, with mechanisms in place to allow for more detailed specifiers based on an individual's unique set of autistic and coinciding traits and how much help they would need to survive compared to a non-autistic person. Yes, that's it. That's what all of this is about. Now, many patients, caregivers, researchers, medical professionals were pleased with this change. Many patients, caregivers, researchers, and medical professionals were unhappy with this change, and many have mixed feelings. It's an ongoing discussion about a complicated issue that, regardless of anyone's personal beliefs or preferences, is going to be subject to change based on the latest peer-reviewed scientific discoveries and developing understanding of how people work. Now, some of those who oppose this change are parents and professionals concerned with more severely disabled family members and patients who fit under the autism diagnosis and require the most labor-intensive and monetarily expensive solutions to even begin to be properly catered for. When caregiving parents and doctors raise concerns that the DSM-5 classifications may reduce the visibility of the challenges faced by those autistic people with the highest support needs, not only do I find that, in isolation, to be a legitimate topic for discussion, but that's a concern I had before hearing about it elsewhere. It's a concern that I had even while I was fighting my own self-advocacy battle for fair treatment from my college, a battle which, looking back on it a decade later, came within a few pen strokes of instigating a lawsuit against the school had certain people not made the right decisions on my behalf. Even with the challenges I was facing in having my documented disabilities respected, my main personal concern with the DSM-5 restructuring of autism and adjacent disorders was that I did not want my struggles to be conflated with those people who need much more help than I could even begin to make use of. In other words, I didn't want popular perception of the support needs of others to be diminished on account of the comparatively minor accommodations that I personally needed to function. So no, even if I don't reject the present terminology, I don't find dissatisfaction with the diagnostic nomenclature featured in DSM-5 to be fundamentally illegitimate. Now, to me, the sensible thing to do for people with those concerns would be to petition the American Psychiatric Association to consider an enhanced diagnostic delineation for neurodevelopmental disorders that better serves patients of all support needs levels and descriptions and diagnoses, while avoiding generalizations that have done harm to vulnerable populations of disabled people in the past. Here's the problem. A number of people who are unhappy with the DSM-5's construction of autism spectrum disorder have instead gone on a prolonged public smear campaign against autistic people other than their own children. They deny the identities and struggles or even outright attacking autistic people, including clinically diagnosed patients who might have previously, rather than autism disorder, have received and now retired diagnoses under the DSM-4, such as Asperger's syndrome. Critics who have done the dumb thing by taking this route have not only falsely described the DSM-5 as having lowered its standards to include perfectly functional non-disabled people who would have never previously received a disability diagnosis at all, but they've gone around falsely claiming that DSM-5 somehow enshrined the non-clinical self-identification of autism as an official, universally recognized means by which someone could demand accommodations, therapy, special education, and insurance coverage. Some viewers skeptical of my position at this point and unfamiliar with the material I'm going to be criticizing may already be gearing up to dismiss my video series as a campaign to disparage doctors for speaking out against amateur self-diagnosis of autism. Well, if you feel that way, if you feel that only licensed professionals in a clinical setting have the authority to issue patients neurodevelopmental disability diagnoses worthy of being respected, I'm going to demonstrate why you definitely should not be happy about the NCSA's activities in the disability advocacy space, at least in regards to the podcast episodes I'll be discussing. Definitely not when they make really wild statements about clinically diagnosed autistic people.
It is so utterly meaningless that, this highly successful, articulate person who's completely functional can adopt that term and not a single member of the media questions it.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or leaving themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education. It's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
People do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately identity cannot be touched, and people are able to claim whatever identity they want in the minute.
But they're clinically diagnosed. If you'll say this in response to a story about clinically diagnosed autistic people, why should anyone trust anything you have to say about any of these related topics? Especially when people use baseless accusations like these to characterize relatively higher functioning clinically diagnosed autistic people as an insurgent political movement of disability imposters who are appropriating the struggles of severely autistic people while wrongfully hoarding therapy sessions, special education, and other resources meant for real disabled people, all as part of an identity fantasy or even a fetish?
Become sadly almost faddish for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. And I think that in sharp contrast to many patients with autism, particularly the ones that Dr. Lopez and I work with, autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift. It's special to be this way, and you bring something special and unique to the world that other people don't have, and it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent.
Because many neurodiversity proponents that claim to be autistics are really not autistics. Okay, and you have to be very careful. Because,
I agree.
So some of the people that go into the soapbox and start claiming that all of their problems have been due by society instead of getting responsibility, their own responsibility for their problems. Some of them have really deep personality disorders.
To intentionally repeat myself, this mode of discourse from certain critics of the DSM-5 and of autism self-advocacy specifically includes public statements of disapproval against people for supposedly wrongfully intruding into the disability space, even when the specific individuals they may be complaining about are not only specifically professionally diagnosed, but are people who even up to and beyond 30 years ago would have been described in old versions of the DSM as possessing disabilities characterized by qualitative, clinically significant impairments in important areas of functioning. These are people who could have potentially received an autism diagnosis since at least the late 70s, and since 1994 were considered legitimate in regards to consideration for intervention, therapy, special education, accommodations, medication, and other suitable forms of disability assistance under the former Asperger's syndrome category, as well as PPD-NOS and Rett syndrome. But post-2013, now that these same people have a primary diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder rather than Asperger's syndrome or several other retired diagnoses, some critics of the APA's terminology decision now treat their presence and visibility in the disability space as an act of hostility against their children and an act of these people having committed theft of terminology that should apply only to their own children. The president of the National Council on Severe Autism considers these people's mere existence on the relatively higher functioning end of the autism spectrum to be, in her own words, a debacle. But her opinion is much, much stronger than that, and she could explain that for herself.
I think this has been one of the great debacles of autism, right? That, people who are cognitively, have strong cognitive abilities, strong communication abilities, strong adaptive abilities, but have kind of social quirks are in the same category, the same diagnostic category as my kids who are nonverbal and function like at a preschool level.
And that's a problem.
It's absurd. It's not just a problem. I mean, it's violently absurd. It's radically absurd.
Violently absurd? Are you serious, Jill? How could that possibly be appropriate for the president of an autism advocacy group to say about anyone, let alone people who are literally only receiving accommodations and services within this space because their characteristics were professionally evaluated as posing clinically significant challenges to their functionality? And you want to use language that casts their mere presence as an absurd act of violence against your children? Autism Speaks is on a permanent persona non grata basis with the autism self-advocacy community, but I'm not aware of anything this explicitly problematic in their recent history as what Jill Escher, president of the National Council on Severe Autism, just said in that clip. I'll take heat from the online autism advocacy community all day for defending Jill's right to be dissatisfied with the current formal diagnostic nomenclature, and I'm not interested in the idea of using every opportunity to challenge my opponents by nitpicking the superficial sensitivity or political correctness of their language choices. And that's an effort I really find to be a waste of time, and even worse than that, I think it's boring. But as the president of the National Council on Severe Autism, for Jill Escher to frame the standards for today's autism spectrum disorder level 1 diagnosis as a violent absurdity is recklessly irresponsible at best. This causes people, including those with professionally documented clinically significant impairments, to be perceived as holding violent contempt against others who are more severely disabled than them simply for having received that ASD1 diagnosis and receiving the services and care that diagnosis opens up to them that they would otherwise have no way to even attempt to access and that they need in order to thrive in environments designed for non-disabled people. To critics of high-functioning autism like these, that perceived act of hostility from higher functioning autistic people can come in the form of those people simply being diagnosed and being open about that fact. And that's used as grounds to define all autistic people other than those whose profiles closely resemble their own children or their own patients as fakers who are maliciously appropriating the struggles of children and patients when all they're doing is describing themselves using the language of their own professionally administered diagnoses. This is contributing to the current atmosphere in which online vigilantes going on witch hunts for alleged disability fraudsters are circulating what they call faker lingo guides, which can include descriptions of characteristics, terminology, and behaviors related to autism taken directly from the DSM, but provided as ways to tell if someone is faking autism. And for those who don't know, the DSM is an internationally recognized professional grade manual issued by the American Psychiatric Association for clinicians to diagnose disorders and conditions. But these amateur witch hunters are using the traits listed in it to accuse online strangers of faking autism to gain undeserved privileges and positive attention. Now, coinciding with this trend, online fake claimers have targeted diagnosed autistic people who have, for example, shared VHS home video footage of their childhoods from as far back as the 90s of themselves exhibiting literal textbook definition autistic motor mannerisms, only for them to be accused of being imposters who are faking autistic traits for clout and hopping on board a recent trend of alleged disability glamour. Fake claiming like this can also lead to students at the college level encountering problems, one example of which a staff member was caught not only destroying the clinical documentation of disabled students they felt didn't deserve accommodations, but then going as far as to create forged paperwork from those students' high schools that falsely stated that those students were never diagnosed with anything and were self-identifying with disability all along without any clinically authoritative basis for doing so in order to dishonestly demand accommodations. Many autistic people have described being shooed out of online spaces advertised as places for those affected by autism, but instead are private clubs only for the parents of autistic children who might be described as severe cases. And this has contributed to an opposing stereotyping trope in which antagonistic autism moms are characterized by actually autistic people on social media as a monolithic supervillain out to disrupt their lives and invalidate their struggles. And in spite of all the trouble I'm going through right now to draw attention to this toxic behavior from the gatekeeping parents of autistic children, I don't think the evil autism mom archetype is cute or funny. I want to discourage that archetype, and I'm not alone in the autism self-advocacy community for feeling that way. But what acts against me in that desire is when real-life antagonistic autism moms, like Amber, make themselves into walking, living, breathing tropes while claiming to be autism advocates. The autism community would have been better served by Mr. Softy.
You actually have an autistic child, right?
I wasn't pissed at Amber before when I made an entire video just about her, but I am now. Not because I disagree with her on disability issues, but because people like her go to extremes that make me look foolish for even suggesting that autistic self-advocates and these autism attack moms could ever find a middle ground. Amber went on Buck Angel's podcast for an interview in which she was crying a fountain of tears while incorrectly accusing the DSM-5 of permitting irreverent children to, in her words, falsely self-proclaim autism and make a mockery of her son's suffering.
All these kids on TikTok that have hijacked, and these people who are like, oh, I'm neurodivergent. That's why putting an umbrella over all of these things really has sickened me. Like, the DSM-5 changed, and so now Asperger's is a part of ASD, which it should have never been.
Nope, I totally agree with you.
I don't believe that autism should ever been umbrellaed, and I'm gonna get choked up a little bit.
I am too, actually. I am. I'm sorry.
It's really hard to see that all of these kids are making a mockery of what my son, these kids who are like, oh, I'm neurodivergent because it's cool. It's not right.
It makes me so mad, Amber, that these kids are getting away with this stuff and nobody's pushing back on them. And like, where are the fucking adults? Where are they?
Amber, I don't feel like arguing that misinformation and bad faith claims of disability on social media aren't an actual concern. But how can the DSM-5, a professional grade diagnostic manual written specifically for licensed psychologists, psychiatrists, and other healthcare workers, possibly allow for random members of the public, let alone literal children, to credibly claim disability status that would prove to be irrefutably enforceable for official purposes. And Amber didn't stop there. She went on to accuse children of falsely claiming autism for the sake of social media popularity.
Older kids do this because they're getting the accolades. And that's
right.
Kids with autism, why it's such on a rise is because you are going with what is in style.
That's right.
All it is like the socialness of having a disorder.
And even if that turned out to be true, and an actual problem that should be addressed, which I myself believe there is evidence of in some cases, Amber still derailed her own argument by insisting that these children were validating their delusions of being autistic by jumping in line for therapy sessions that would otherwise be going to her own high support needs autistic son.
And they're going to do the same shit with other kind of things like autism and all that. They're going to be like, oh, well, maybe you can just say you have autism. It's very dangerous.
We've been on a waiting list for one of his ABA therapies because all these other kids who just ID as it, they haven't even had an actual diagnosis, are getting it first.
Okay, there you go. Everybody, did you just hear that?
Yeah, I did hear that. Amber was so upset that her own kid was on a waiting list for ABA therapy that she was willing to publicly accuse literal children of committing disability fraud as a plot to integrate themselves with autism communities on social media. Communities that Amber is outraged by, but knows nothing about.
That's right.
All it is like the socialness of having a disorder.
And I say that Amber knows nothing about these autism communities, but because unless there's critical details that Amber failed to explain back when she had the chance on Buck's show, then simply by making that accusation, Amber is proving that she's completely unaware that members of social media circles that she's upset at for supposedly faking autism to jump in line for her son's ABA therapy appointments are people who are outspokenly against ABA and consider ABA's continued practice a legalized form of torture against autistic people.
We've been on a waiting list for one of his ABA therapies because all these other kids who just ID as it, they haven't even had an actual diagnosis, are getting it first.
Unless there are critical details that Amber left out, which I am unaware of, that means that she went on a podcast that got at least 17,000 views on YouTube alone and defamed diagnosed autistic children who, due to the nature of ABA, are likely relatively lower functioning and have very significant support needs, because Amber was mad about these children getting access to therapy services before her own son. That's fucked up. Amber has no right to pretend to be an autism advocate and an autism expert and shape public perception of disability issues by making shit up to suit her agenda of making her son appear as sympathetic as possible. And when I say making shit up, I don't mean her personally rejecting the neurodiversity paradigm. I mean making shit up as in saying things about autism that are directly contradicted by medical and psychiatric textbooks, including older editions of those books that Amber insists were more accurate than the current ones that ruined everything with their alleged trivialization of autism. For example, Amber said, or at least very strongly implied, that only children with her son's profound manifestation of what she calls severe autism exhibit repetitive motor mannerisms and hand flapping known as stimming, which according to her proved that higher functioning autistic people who formerly might have been considered Asperger's syndrome patients were faking these so-called true autistic behaviors for attention.
He's really generally like what autism is, what autism can be. So stimming is like my son flaps, but it's like a rigid flap. So it's kind of, I would describe it more as a seizure where it's uncontrolled. Now you see on TikTok, all these people are like, oh, I'm stimming. This is a stim. And it's not a stim. This isn't a stim. I can show you, Buck, videos of my son stimming where he clenches his whole body and he goes into it. It's like an uncontrollable thing, like an actual seizure.
Amber can't pretend to be an autism expert when she also happens to not give a shit that the literal textbook definition of Asperger's syndrome specifically mentions hand or finger flapping and complex full body movements. And instead, she made an oopsie by explaining the former Asperger's syndrome diagnosis using her personal made-up definition of being nothing but trivial social awkwardness that didn't constitute a disability recognized as worthy of care, accommodations, and treatment, as though Asperger's syndrome wasn't a clinically recognized disorder, but just a fancy way to call someone a non-disabled nerd.
And these people who are like, oh, I'm neurodivergent. That's why putting an umbrella over all of these things really has sickened me. Like, the DSM-5 changed, and so now Asperger's is a part of ASD, which it should have never been.
No, I totally agree with you.
It drove me crazy quite a lot. The idea of being in a room with a loud band, or people talking too loudly, or sounds happening outside the door. I couldn't ignore anything. Everything was right there, right in front of me. I could not tell my brain to shut off anything.
And it is conformity, and
it's crazy.
It's so sad, is what it is.
Asperger's syndrome is. It's a disorder. It's a social learning disorder. That it means what it says it is. It causes people to have difficulty socializing. I guess I just listed a deficit I have. And another one I have is formulating sentences, which is included in thinking of sentences for this interview.
Kids with autism, why it's such on a rise is because you are going with what is in style.
I would hear clocks, I'd hear flies, I'd hear people screeching little pencils on paper, or things clattering on the floor.
That's right.
All it is like the socialness of having a disorder.
All of it was at the exact same time. Not being able to filter it out is horrible.
Do you think these kids have some form of autism that are doing this? Yeah.
That's just my experience from a classroom, which is why I was so happy to be homeschooled. It's, in some cases, I could say it literally saved my life.
Do you think these kids have some form of autism that are doing this? Yeah.
I'm gonna be real honest and really.
Please, that's.
I'm going to gatekeep autism, where I don't think if you're awkward or if you think different or if you can't be in a social room that you have autism. I don't believe that autism should ever been umbrellaed, and I'm going to get choked up a little bit.
I am too, actually. I am. I'm sorry.
It's really hard to see that all of these kids are making a mockery of what my son, and these kids who are like, oh, I'm neurodivergent because it's cool. It's not right.
For literal decades before it was officially made part of autism spectrum disorder, Asperger's syndrome diagnoses were candidates for extensive services, intervention, and treatment. And by the way, if you consider treatment, that being a course of action seeking in good faith to ameliorate pain, discomfort, or difficulty, to be a bad word, I don't care. As for Amber, I already did a full-length video criticizing her statements in her appearance on Buck Angel's podcast. Back then, I dealt with Amber in such an understanding and forgiving manner that the main feedback I got from people who saw my video, and even loved it, was that I was being too nice to her. And as pissed as I was about the misinformation in her interview with Buck, I still stand by my approach to criticizing her in that past video. I dealt with Amber based on the understanding that she is the dedicated and traumatized mother of an extremely vulnerable child whose requirement for lifelong care and assistance is literally unlimited. I explained in detail why Amber would be in a unique position to, for no fault of her own, misunderstand strangers who said they were autistic but whose outward characteristic profile seemed very different from her son's. I argued that Amber, as a parent in that position, can't possibly be expected to require in-depth knowledge of autism aside from what she needed to know to care for her own high support needs child.
So, what's the name of that book? Sorry, what's the name of that book?
Desk reference. It's a PDR.
Without consideration of my approval or lack thereof of the point she was trying to make, I applauded Amber for, at one point in the interview, referring to her copy of the physician's desk reference as a professional grade primary source concerning contraindications of a medication she was discussing.
Oh, it says
wait,
it here. In
wait. You have gold.
Yeah, it's right here.
I even applauded Amber for specifically warning viewers that her personal copy of the physician's desk reference was over a decade out of date and that newer versions might have updated information.
And mind you, this is a 2012 edition.
I have an updated copy of the PDR in my collection too, but that's just because I'm a fucking nerd with an interest in pharmaceuticals and their effects on humans, and I want to know which ones might be used in the future to cure humans of this disease they have where their tails stop growing about 30 weeks before the end of pregnancy. Anyway, in my previous video, I explained that many important things Amber may have said to Buck that would have painted her statements in a fairer light might have been edited out of the final podcast by Buck to stick to his hour-long format, with the host being unaware that their contextual importance allowed Amber's points to actually make sense in the way she intended. And when discussing Amber's grievances with online autism content from vloggers on sites like TikTok, I even did her the favor of assuming that every single video she saw of an allegedly autistic person was of someone merely faking it to gain online clout, which I don't deny is something that does happen and is a problem when it does happen. I even restricted my commentary to only cover 12 minutes of things Amber said out of an hour-long discussion she had with Buck in terms of the final podcast as it was published. And even with me giving Amber all of those concessions, it still took me 4 hours to break down in detail how virtually everything Amber said over the course of only 12 minutes was hypocritical, toxic bullshit that revolved around the offensive fallacy that any person who could do things that her own son unfortunately might never be able to do himself was therefore provably faking disability to fish for undeserved positive attention. And I only made a video about Amber's interview with Buck because Amber repeatedly went out of her way to describe herself not only as an autism advocate that could be trusted on matters of autism, but as a worker in the medical field in some unknown capacity that she, for some reason, elected not to specify, aside from the implication that her opinion should be trusted to reflect high quality and accuracy.
And then I also am a special needs mother and advocate. And I'm an advocate here in Colorado. So I'm in the medical field. I'm in the medical field. Never worked pediatrics except like a clinical route that I had to do.
If Amber was just some random parent venting her frustrations at the ongoing crisis-level failure of our culture to provide the most vulnerable among us with proper conditions, and in the course of that frustration and out of honest misunderstanding, she blamed the wrong people for lack of available resources to secure her child's human rights and well-being, I never would have responded to that interview in the way that I did. But there is no way I could allow someone to present themselves as an autism advocate and as a medical professional and perpetuate misconceptions that set back all disabled people and not respond, regardless of how insignificantly small my audience is on the internet.
Amber some beautiful stuff because she really opened up and told us gold. Oh my God, you guys, we got such good information today. I'm like really, really happy.
Aside from possibly accusing diagnosed autistic children of committing disability fraud to steal her son's therapy sessions, she also incorrectly described stimming as a form of having a seizure, and on top of that said that having obsessive-compulsive disorder automatically qualified someone as being autistic under DSM-5, both of which aren't true. but I spoke about Amber for 4 hours already in an earlier video, so if you want more detail, feel free to find the link in my description. The point here and now in barrier aggression is that with cases like Amber and so many other self-proclaimed non-autistic autism gatekeepers and critics of the mere clinical validity of relatively higher functioning autistic people, I personally think it's extreme and weird that the parents and doctors of disabled people who require round-the-clock care and assistance and remain, in spite of decades of hard-fought and sorely won societal progress, still stigmatized by the general public. I would expect that such caregivers wouldn't spend any amount of time or effort attacking unrelated people, unrelated disabled people, simply for having support needs that are less extensive than those of their own children and patients. But this is what the president of the National Council on Severe Autism thinks of as extreme and weird in the world of autism discourse.
I think we're going to talk about like just an example of how extreme and weird they ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma.
Wait, what? That was supposed to be an example of weird extremism? What the fuck?
An example of how extreme and weird they ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. Never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, these doctors with autism. And I'm curious, you guys, you've had long careers in medicine. How many doctors have you met who you would diagnose with autism?
None.
The one in, what was that, Grey's Anatomy? There was one.
Oh, the one on TV.
Yeah.
The TV doctor, right, who doesn't exist in real life.
Jill, what kind of shit is this? For the president of an autism advocacy nonprofit to laugh and joke that autistic doctors don't exist in real life because there is an autistic doctor featured as a character on Grey's Anatomy. It's like if someone who is the president of a marine conservation organization tried to argue that sea sponges don't exist based upon the TV show SpongeBob SquarePants. And Jill wants to use her National Council on Severe Autism to shape public policy that will actually impact the lives of autistic people, while publishing messages that promote and validate distrust and disbelief towards autistic people and disabled people of many backgrounds and descriptions who are already facing targeted harassment and accusations of faking autism, even when their disabilities have been clinically documented by licensed professionals. Holy shit.
How many doctors have you met who you would diagnose with autism?
None.
The one in, what was that, Grey's Anatomy? There was one.
Oh, the one on TV.
Yeah.
The TV doctor, right, who doesn't exist in real life.
Within the context of this specific NCSA podcast episode, Jill's logic here is amazingly hypocritical in ways that I'll highlight in future parts of barrier aggression, probably sometime around part 6 or 7 at the rate I'm going. But for my response right now, in part 1, I'll just point out that on the NCSA's website, supporting programs that enable high support needs, aka severely affected or lower functioning autistic people, to enter the workforce and be visible within their greater communities is a primary objective of theirs, and the NCSA specifically speaks in support of creation for sub-minimal wage jobs for autistic people of that description. But if you're a clinically diagnosed lower support needs, aka a higher functioning autistic person, and are facing discrimination while you try to work your way into a self-sustaining career, then go to hell, I guess, you weird extremists who think you could just arbitrarily claim any identity you want just because your doctor's diagnosed you with autism spectrum disorder.
And they're also able to achieve so many more things. I mean, just thinking about somebody who's been through medical school, that means that they succeeded at a very high level throughout their secondary education. They succeeded at a high level in college, and then they went on to medical school. They completed a residency. They succeeded. They functioned and succeeded at an extremely high level. They can't recognize. They don't want to recognize. It offends them. It upsets them to imagine that some people who have a diagnosis of autism need somebody to take care of them 24 hours a day. They can't dress themselves. They can't toilet themselves. They cannot make any type of decisions. Maybe they can choose between having a vanilla and a strawberry ice cream. They can't live independently. They're never going to be able to do any of those things that these other individuals, like physicians who claim they have autism, can do.
But they're clinically diagnosed.
People do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing like for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately like identity cannot be touched, and people are able to claim whatever identity they want. And the minute
I can't stress this enough. Dr. Lee Wachtel is saying this in direct and specific response to an article about professionally diagnosed autistic people who were examined by licensed clinicians in a formal setting and are sharing their experiences of workplace discrimination because of their disability backgrounds. And this particular NCSA podcast episode, and in a few others I'll mention as well, Jill and her friends are fuming like police inspectors reviewing newspaper coverage of a bank robbery where the thieves were wrongfully made out to be heroes.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
We all have our little quirks and differences. Taking away terms needed for education and policy making? I swear I am not presenting this footage out of context. These NCSA podcast clips are in response to an online news article about clinically diagnosed autistic people speaking out against workplace discrimination directed against autistic people. And yes, while it's true that some of those people under the old DSM-4 might have received a diagnosis of former Asperger's syndrome or PBD-NOS or Rett syndrome rather than autism disorder, which is what I expect these NCSA panelists would say to prove their point. Even if we were to assume that were the case, for a patient to receive, for example, a former Asperger's syndrome diagnosis from a licensed professional, that patient would have to receive, at an absolute minimum, a evaluation that proves that they possess what DSM-4 calls multiple qualitatively clinically significant impairments in important areas of functioning. Once again, that's the bare fucking minimum of what it would take to even get your foot in the door of being a candidate for a possible Asperger's syndrome diagnosis. And out of their frustration with the technical details of DSM-5's updated neurodevelopmental disability terminology, that is what they want to dismiss as trivial quirks and differences.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education.
To repeat myself again regarding the concrete incorrectness of their thinking there, this is no bearing on any position regarding the legitimacy or lack of such with the concept of autistic self-diagnosis. The article these people are reacting to is specifically about clinically diagnosed autism patients. So why trust them on anything, let alone educating the public about autism? We already have a problem where poorly informed parents of autistic children sincerely think that only people who precisely match their children's description of autistic traits are legitimate in calling themselves autistic when that's in their actual diagnostic title, and they just assume that anyone who didn't attend a specialized school only for autistic students proves that they never needed any therapy or disability services, and that their diagnosis could only be explained by recent revisionist meddling and the DSM arbitrarily making everyone autistic, which was, as an objective matter of fact, never the case at all.
So the answer is the DSM-5. I think the diagnostic manual the doctors are using needs to be updated and changed, and real specific language needs to be created so that we can honor everybody and get them the help they need, but it's not the same thing. Putting everybody on the autism spectrum to me is not helpful, and it's going to make everyone autistic soon, and it's diluted the very meaning of the spectrum in the first place.
In spite of that not being the case, these sorts of people ignore that for many kids with autism and other disabilities, significant therapy and extensive services are the only reason they were able to attempt to function in a normal school environment in the first place. My example here is Christine, the mother of an autistic daughter, who together have made a number of media appearances online and on mainstream television.
The kind of autism I have is a communication disorder. Like, for example, when I was a little girl, I walked around in circles talking to myself. I wanted to join the conversation, but I didn't know how, and my brain wouldn't do what I was telling it to do. And I've had 20 years of speech therapy, 15 years of occupational therapy to be able to talk like everyone else to get where I am today.
So we're in public and Abby has a stim or arms are flailing,
Yeah, and some people in the spectrum tend to rock back and forth and flop their hands. And
that's a stim.
Why you gotta
That's
call
not
me
a
that
stim,
out?
huh?
I was doing that just now.
No, literally.
Wow, that's closer to my own experience than I have the courage to discuss. But this is about her silly-ass mom who loves her daughter but has some misconceptions.
Okay, that's a big question. Why do I think that there's more people being diagnosed than years ago in the autism world? And this is just my opinion after 2 decades kind of watching what's been happening. Abby is neurodeficit, and a lot of people getting diagnosed today are neurodifferent. Neurodifferent means you didn't need speech and OT and all kinds of therapies and music therapy, and you didn't need an aide to go to school, and you didn't get pulled out of school to go to an autism school. You actually went to a typical school and you had no support, and you were neurodifferent. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. You are neurodifferent, and Abby and people like Abby and Abby's programs were neurodeficit. Abby had 20 years of speech and OT and other services just to be able to talk like a neurodifferent person already can.
Christine, you hypothetically addressed me directly, so I'll hypothetically address you directly. You said that this TikTok video of yours was just your personal opinion, which is a smart thing for you to say. But in spite of that, you still decided to publish a message that makes you look like a dumbass stage mom who thinks that being the third wheel on your daughter's reality TV dating show appearance gives you credibility at making up fake shit like neurodifferent, a phrase of your own invention with zero backing from the scientific or disability communities, and you use that made-up word to spread explicit misinformation about who is and is not legitimate and accessing disability supports and services or calling themselves disabled. Your daughter receiving occupational therapy and communication therapy and being assigned aides and going to a specialized school is what she was entitled to maximize her potential. Those things weren't given to your daughter to be a fucking flex for your non-autistic ass to use as an undirected, weaponized talking point to invalidate other people's disabilities, let alone people you've never even interacted with before. I was diagnosed within the same range that you, Christine, who is not a fucking doctor, decided to diminish as neurodifferent to remove me from the same semantic space as your daughter, who you insist, unlike me, has actual deficits and needed occupational therapy and aids and supports, while, according to you, who wasn't fucking there, I not only obviously didn't need those things, but obviously didn't have them. Meanwhile, I was able to function in a non-specialized public school because I had occupational therapy, because I had social skills therapy, because I had aides assigned to me and scribes assigned to me, because I was permitted to carry and use special equipment. And if you think the diagnosis I received was only made available to me because of the DSM-5 arbitrarily making everyone autistic, including people like me who you assume don't need those disability services, you need to understand that not only was I diagnosed under the same diagnostic manual that your daughter was, but I was among the first people to be diagnosed within that diagnostic manual's construction of the autism spectrum range of developmental disorders, and I received that diagnosis before your daughter was born, let alone diagnosed.
Do not cite the deep magic to me, witch. I was there when it was written.
So to see you run around describing autistic people today who have the same characteristics that were considered valid to receive those supports 30 fucking years ago, of not even needing those supports, is so fucking stupid that I feel sorry for your daughter to be so publicly associated you, because I can trust that you're an awesome mother to her and an awesome source of support and encouragement to her. But you need to not use your perceived position of expertise to say incorrect, dumbass bullshit about autistic people who are already facing accusations of disability fraud based on misinformation, specifically like yours. And Christine, if you somehow end up seeing this video from my irrelevant, irate cartoon dog ass and think, oh, I wasn't talking about you, I was talking about the others who didn't need those things, you need to understand that whether or not you grant me your meaningless blessing and permission to call myself autistic or disabled, or as being a person with neurodevelopmental deficits, that you saying this kind of shit not only causes people exactly like me and also exactly like your daughter to get accused of being autism imposters, it also causes people exactly like me and also exactly like your daughter who needed those services to even attempt to enter the non-disabled world to refuse to accept those services for themselves because their guilt induced by even asking to have their needs respected makes them feel like they're stealing resources they can't possibly deserve, even when they've been clinically diagnosed as needing those things.
Abby is neurodeficit, and a lot of people getting diagnosed today are neurodifferent. Neurodifferent means you didn't need speech and OT and all kinds of therapies and music therapy, and you didn't need an aide to go to school, and you didn't get pulled out of school to go to an autism school. You actually went to a typical school, and you had no support, and you were neurodifferent.
This point has nothing to do with disagreements over the neurodiversity paradigm or the autism self-advocacy movement, or even of self-diagnosis of autism. This supersedes all of that and is just scientifically, medically, and administratively actually fucking wrong.
So the answer is the DSM-5. I think the diagnostic manual the doctors are using needs to be updated and changed, and real specific language needs to be created so that we can honor everybody and get them the help they need, but it's not the same thing. Putting everybody on the autism spectrum to me is not helpful, and it's going to make everyone autistic soon, and it's diluted the very meaning of the spectrum in the first place.
You know what really destroys the meaning of a spectrum? When you take something called a spectrum and insist that only one specific wavelength within that spectrum should be permitted to be visible or named or identified as belonging there at all, especially when that one acceptable wavelength by sheer coincidence happens to be the one that your own daughter resides within.
Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference. Because you don't have a deficit, you have a difference.
And Christine doesn't just say this shit to autistic people through the filter of cyberspace. She spews it directly in the faces of actual autistic people in settings in which they were encouraged to discuss their experiences as autistic people.
Yes, I am disabled because throughout my entire life, I've had to deal with things like sensory overload, dealing with high emotions at times and stuff like that. But I also was raised to be a go-getter and if I put my mind to anything, I can accomplish my goals. And I have accomplished stuff. I'm a writer. I've written about being on the spectrum for Insider, The Doe, and places like that. And I don't let my disability stop me. So it's like, we live in this world where having a disability is a bad thing, and most people kind of operate that way and like view disabled people in a negative light. And so for me, whenever someone calls me disabled, it's definitely a trigger for me, to be honest.
Yeah, I would agree with exactly what you're saying. That was kind of the reason I came up as well.
And what does Christine say to this man? To his fucking face?
Now, I would say that because this autism word and spectrum now has successful people and writers who are neurodifferent and people who have had 20 years of speech therapy.
And I'm one of them.
And you are, and rock star over here. But it's confusing.
You know what's really confusing, Christine? The fact that you think that someone being a writer not only proves that they can't be within the same range of disability as your daughter, but also this idea of yours that someone being quote-unquote successful proves that they can't be in the same range of disability as your daughter and couldn't have needed or benefited from the same disability services and therapies as your autistic daughter. Your autistic daughter, who was featured on a mainstream television reality dating show and sings and dances on the internet, which unfortunately is used by a lot of people to specifically accuse your daughter of being too successful to possibly be legitimately autistic or disabled. And I'm not saying this to imply any wrongdoing or misconduct from your daughter, Abby. I'm just saying this to really explain that you're full of shit. And I'm definitely not letting you get away with going on a platform like this and spreading the actual fucking lie that a writer could not be legitimately disabled or autistic and couldn't have needed years of disability services like occupational therapy as your daughter did, because I, an autistic writer, for whom writing was and is my primary source of expression with people around me who I am otherwise frequently alienated from, happens to have also went through occupational therapy and is using that resulting enhanced functionality to tell you that you're full of shit in ways I will only now begin to explain. But I'll leave you alone for a moment first, because you're confused.
Now, I would say that because this autism word and spectrum now has successful people and writers who are neurodifferent and people who have had 20 years of speech therapy.
And I'm one of them.
And you are, and rock star over here. But it's confusing.
Christine uses her own daughter's therapy regimen made for her unique disability support needs profile, along with the fact that another autistic person who she knows nothing about happens to have found success as a writer, to retract his autism diagnosis by calling him neurodifferent rather than autistic.
Abby is neurodeficit, and a lot of people getting diagnosed today are neurodifferent.
A self-invented phrase of Christine's that she specifically deploys as a replacement term for people she feels are too successful compared to her own daughter.
Neurodifferent means you didn't need speech and OT and all kinds of therapies and music therapy, and you didn't need an aide to go to school, and you didn't get pulled out of school to go to an autism school. You actually went to a typical school, and you had no support, and you were neurodifferent.
Her own daughter, who appeared on a reality TV dating show and has multiple social media accounts, including TikTok. If Amber was by chance browsing the web and encountered Christine's daughter and saw someone participating in a reality TV dating show and literally singing and dancing on TikTok and talking about stimming and flapping in online videos that she actually demonstrates on camera, Amber would most certainly accuse her of being an autism imposter, making a mockery of her son's suffering, because her son can't even speak, let alone use a computer.
All these kids on TikTok that have hijacked, oh, I stim.
So yes, I find it amazing the extent to which, based on their on-screen statements, Christine and Amber would seem to be ideal arm-in-arm allies. But if Amber saw Christine's daughter on TikTok talking about her so-called autism, she would likely consider her a disability imposter that was personally disrespecting her own child's struggles, all because the DSM-5 enshrined self-diagnosis is officially recognized, even though that never happened.
And these kids could write on the internet, TikTok, and do all this stuff. My son doesn't understand the use of a computer. My son doesn't understand this. My son is 12 years old. He still wears diapers. My son does not speak. My son cannot feed himself. My son does not know time. My son does not know weather. My son elopes. My son, he hits himself. He hits us. That is autism.
You call yourselves an alliance, but we saw what that means. Your soldiers are at each other's throats.
Well, Amber and Christine Romeo are just members of the public. One who made it on someone else's podcast and the other whose daughter happened to be on a dating show for autistic people. But I wouldn't expect to hear that kind of bullshit from an actual doctor, let alone one serving as a panelist on an autism advocacy group's official podcast.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences, and that's fine. However, the use of the word autism, it's taken to the extremes because we need it for policymaking, for accessing services, for accessing education. And
does this doctor not understand that autistic people who don't need 24-hour care and don't need to live in a fully medicalized institutional setting may still need extensive special education services in order to successfully engage with an education system designed for non-disabled people? This is the kind of shit where, for just one hypothetical example, a grade school student who, due to actual neurodevelopmental issues, can't manipulate a crayon like a normal student could, and without being tested and diagnosed, might spend every day in detention during recess for failing to complete coloring assignments on time, all while being accused of disobedience or laziness and getting calls to their parents about bad behavior and getting punished at home as well. Oh wait, that's not hypothetical. That kid was me. And somehow the system let that happen to me after I was already fully diagnosed and enrolled in multiple forms of therapy, counseling, and training. And this doctor is complaining about people within the same diagnostic range that deals with shit like that, self-identifying quirks and differences as though they took online personality quizzes comparing themselves to Sheldon from Big Bang Theory.
I don't see a problem with some people identifying their differences or labeling themselves neurodivergent. It's fine. We all have our little quirks and our little differences.
Where is this commentary about self-identification and arbitrary claiming of identities even originating from? It comes from nowhere.
It's become almost, sadly, almost like faddish to, for individuals who have the types of challenges that are described in that article to adopt the term of, to identify as being autistic. And I think that in sharp contrast to many patients with autism, particularly the ones that Dr. Lopez and I work with, autism had taken on kind of this character of almost like a fantasy, a gift. It's special to be this way, and you bring something special and unique to the world that other people don't have, and it's become kind of cool and interesting to be neurodivergent.
I mean, before I said the NCSA were like cops reading an article about a jewel heist where the robbers were wrongfully made out to be heroes. But no, this seems so much more strangely personal to them. It's like they're reading about a theft that was specifically committed against their own high support needs autistic children and patients, when the paper they're reading from is actually a blank sheet of paper with nothing printed on it at all.
People do need to have a little bit more guts in terms of speaking up and standing like for the truth. But it's hard. It is definitely hard because nobody is really protected, and we do live in a society where ultimately like identity cannot be touched, and people are able to claim whatever identity they want. And the minute
these people seem so angry, and the complicated part is that they should be angry at the catastrophic failure of our society to provide appropriate lifelong resources for disabled people of all descriptions and support needs levels. I was one of the lucky ones. I was lucky to get recognized, tested, and diagnosed with multiple learning disabilities over the course of numerous day-long sessions at a university, all gratis through the public school system. I was even luckier to live in public school districts that were equipped to provide ongoing therapy services, accommodations to students with a wide variety of physical and learning disabilities, with the former autism disorder being just one of those many disabilities. Now, lots of kids today, not just 30 years ago in the early 90s, but even nowadays and beyond, aren't that lucky. So these mothers and doctors do have something to be angry about, and could have legitimate concerns about DSM-5's revised autism terminology making the struggles of their high support needs children and patients less visible. Reduced visibility can have a concrete detrimental impact on the effectiveness of public policy making that is supposed to benefit all disabled people and their families, even in consideration of the wide and diverse range of possible support requirements disabled people depend upon. Imprecise terminology could even create situations that make it seem like subcategories of disabled people are being suitably represented and provided for, when in fact they are not. And I am not ideologically opposed to the NCSA merely for raising these concerns. Here I've got a news article from the NCSA's own website that spells out a few of these concerns using actual statistics to back up their claims. Let's look through a section here. In an article published last month in JAMA Psychiatry, Rodgard and colleagues examined the scientific literature from 53 years, 1966 through 2019, to determine if and how the differences between ASD subjects and control, normal subjects, changed over time. The authors also examined how these changes correspond to changing definitions of ASD and the associated increases of those diagnosed with ASD. What they found was that the difference between those with and without ASD has decreased over time. In other words, what was once a homogeneous group to a heterogeneous group. This is worrisome, they said, because the growing heterogeneity may create challenges for research. Okay, that itself could be a valid point of interest. It's a tricky situation to collect accurate or consistent data on a human neurodevelopmental concept like autism, which is ever-changing directly as a result of that ongoing research into how the human brain functions. Additionally, there are humanitarian concerns regarding conducting non-life-saving invasive research such as brain scans on people who may not be able to engage with that concept and could perceive the process as traumatic in spite of the good intentions of the people performing the process. So let's read another passage, same article. In March this year, a UK study pointed to an even worse situation. Researchers from the University of Exeter and the University College London examined all high-quality autism studies worldwide in a particular year, 2016, and discovered that only 6% of participants were autistic people with a learning disability. Wow, that does sound like a serious problem and worth raising the alarm over. Speaking from my own experience growing up in the United States, I was formally diagnosed by a team of professionals and went through special education and adjacent services starting from early elementary school all the way through college. And in those special ed programs, there were all kinds of people diagnosed with difficulties that required many kinds of therapy, accommodations, or other services. And the most of these kids weren't even autistic or had Asperger's syndrome, but whether it was dysgraphia, ADHD, dyslexia, all of those, or other things entirely, all of us, have been diagnosed professionally with at least one learning disability of some kind. So even at my college, like the office that distributed services for disabled students had a chart on the wall describing the differences between former autism disorder and former Asperger's syndrome as those diagnoses were then defined, even though they still provided services to students with both of those disabilities and with neither of those diagnoses, as in spite of our wide range and diversity of leads, we had at least one or even several learning disabilities that we had to be clinically documented to require support for at that time. And that was a long time ago under old versions of the DSM. So to see research from credible British institutions like the University of Exeter and the University College of London indicating that only 6% of patients featured in worldwide autism studies were even diagnosed with a single learning disability is genuinely mind-boggling. Like when I said, I was growing up in the US in public school and later on in private college. Many of us in special education had all kinds of learning disabilities without even being diagnosed with autism. But now, 94% of the people studied in the highest quality autism research available worldwide weren't diagnosed with any learning disability? Not even one? I'm sorry, but that's bullshit. Bullshit. Seriously, that is some real bullshit.
That's bullshit! That's bullshit!
Now, to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying it's bullshit data that only 6% of diagnosed autistic people are even diagnosed with an actual learning disability. I'm willing to assume that statistic is true, one way or another. What I'm saying is bullshit is that the US-based National Council on Severe Autism would present data from UK-based universities which say that only 6% of the subjects of high-quality autism research had learning disabilities. And the reason that's bullshit is because the term learning disability literally means something different in Britain than it does in America.
That's bullshit! That's fucked up!
In the United States of America, learning disability means a wide range of clinically recognized conditions, disorders, and syndromes that would adversely impact a student's abilities to successfully function in a typical educational environment, with many people under this description being of average or above average intellectual capability. However, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, learning disability specifically describes impairments within the realm of intellectual delay. In terms of the report the NCSA is citing here, I'm taking the approach of an average reader who will read only this webpage and not do any outside research before taking away a certain impression. I don't have the report in front of me that the article is citing, so I will engage with that report based on what's presented in the NCSA's article. The article wants me to take that 6% statistic seriously one way or another, and in this case I don't think the writers intended deception of any kind. Because the report in question is based out of the UK but is observing data from across the world, I have no way of knowing if those conducting the report are using the UK definition of learning disability to apply to people in other places of the world where that term means something critically different. I would hope that autism researchers from the UK would be aware of that definition difference while collecting and presenting data globally, but based on the NCSA article, I simply don't know. Whether the 6% statistic was specifically in the context of UK-defined learning disability or not, I would also like to know whether or not the statistic was originally presented in a whistleblowing context to the effect of, oh my gosh, only 6% of researched autistic people in 2016 had this attribute. Autism research is failing to include some of the most vulnerable and effective of all autistic people. Or if they were just stating, just objectively, that the 6% statistic, just providing it as a literal description of the research populations of autistic people, and with the results being presented without any real interest in expressing a particular concern. Now, I don't have the original source handy because it was not within the article itself. That's what I'm limiting myself to. But if it was the case that the 6% statistic in the UK university report had no interest in raising any specific concern about the groups of autistic people being studied or being excluded and not studied, that would be questionable to me that the NCSA would present a statistic like that without making it clear that this concern was specific of the NCSA and wasn't mirrored by the report, but instead that the NCSA was simply using this objective third-party statistic to support their own subjective cause for concern. And they can legitimately do that. I wouldn't consider they're doing that deceptive necessarily, but this situation really does demand that level of clarity. We're talking about literal brain science here. Like, this is tantamount to talking about the income of an average worker in one decade over another, but not clarifying if the currency rates were adjusted for inflation or if the workers being compared were even in the same country. Even if the observations were sound at the end of the day, we still need to know those details to make a sensible conclusion and have a properly constructed opinion. Now, completely separate to the previous point about the study itself and ignoring the ambiguity of how it was presented and what its stats were supposed to mean by the original writers, I find it questionable that the NCSA blog presented that 6% statistic without specifying whether learning disability, really more without specifying that term has separate definitions in the UK, where the study was conducted, versus the US, where the NCSA is based out of. Additionally, I can't tell from the NCSA blog post whether or not the writers and editors of the post are aware that there is a difference between UK and US terminology in terms of the learning disability descriptor. Now, if the NCSA writers knew that this difference existed but still chose to fail to specify that, it could potentially flirt with intentionally misrepresenting third-party statistics in order to support their positions. Now, if it turns out that the NCSA writers of that blog post did not know that learning disability specifically meant intellectual delay in UK and not the wide range of disorders, conditions, and syndromes like it does in the US, that to me would cast doubt on their worthiness to be taken seriously in terms of discussing these issues in the first place, especially on a website that would be open to the general public of a US-based audience and not something more likely to be read only by academics who would just know these details as a matter of fact and even accessing this data to begin with. I'm not trying to micromanage the NCSA's use of technical terminology or really take cheap swipes at them for not being aware of very trivial regional differences between US and UK disability language, because like I said, this is brain science. This is something where those details do matter. Now, to make this 100% clear, I don't think the 6% statistic is false in whatever the original context of the research or data collectors were, but with the vagueness of how it's presented in the NCSA's article, I have no way of knowing if that 6% reflects a massive exclusion of an important category of people from the study, or if it just reflects the character of the autistic population in general, or if learning disability, as they deployed it, even meant a UK or US-based definition of the term. Now, to give the absolute best-case scenario to the NCSA, the use of that 6% statistic as presented in the article demonstrates an absence of critical clarity that constitutes an error that I think has the risk of misinforming the public. Now, I say this because the 6% statistic could be something that needs addressing as a unique issue of its own in terms of improving the quality of autism research going forward. But the NCSA blog post is using the 6% statistic from the UK university study on autism research in a way that could reasonably lead a US-based reader to believe that 94% of autistic people included in global autism research don't have disabilities that would prevent them from functioning normally in a typical classroom setting, which is how a US reader is going to understand that term. Now, that notion could lead US-based readers to question why people like that were given any disability diagnosis at all, let alone autism, yet receive accommodations and services in educational and workplace settings that would give non-disabled people possibly unfair advantages. And that would be really a concretely false talking point that has the potential to wind up being discussed in school board meetings or legislative sessions and actually have a direct impact on public disability policy, all while the theoretical misuse of that 6% statistic really had no intention of being malicious or detrimental towards disabled people of any description, but it so easily could be taken out of context based on its deployment on the NCSA website. Merely by dubbing themselves the National Council on Severe Autism, the NCSA have positioned themselves to be perceived as possessing some level of expertise on these subjects, if not actual authority. I don't know if the study done by UK universities that included that 6% figure originally intended that statistic to be used to sound an alarm over an alleged problem with perfectly functional people with arbitrary autism diagnoses sabotaging research and services for those who have extensive research-intensive inability to function normally. I don't know if that 6% figure was intended by the original report authors to imply that 94% of autistic people were merely eccentric in trivial and benign ways and shouldn't have been diagnosed, as the NCSA puts it in the description of the podcast episode I'll be analyzing and reacting to throughout future barrier aggression videos. It is my opinion, however, that whether or not the authors of the report intended those things or not, or even if the writer of the NCSA blog post intended to express that or not, that such an idea sometimes seems like something that some of the more visible personalities and friends of the NCSA either believe themselves or wouldn't mind the public believing, as it fits with certain messages and statements made by those people. From the NCSA podcast episode I cited earlier, we could find in its description on YouTube the phrase quirky and sensitive but otherwise completely normal, appearing in the context of criticizing the diagnoses of individuals that Jill Escher and her friends feel are too successful or too talented to receive an autism diagnosis. In this case, one of the people of interest was Sia, a singer, songwriter, and film director who, if not for her ongoing years of controversy over autism-related issues, I would have spent the rest of my life with but the vaguest passive awareness of. Jill Escher, as part of her role as the president of the National Council on Severe Autism, has a lot to say about Sia in this podcast episode, all to demonstrate her grievance with diagnosed autistic people that Jill claims, without having met them, are too normal, talented, creative, and successful to be autistic.
It is so utterly meaningless that this highly successful, articulate person who's completely functional can adopt that term and not a single member of the media questions it. All they do is parrot it.
And Jill and her two doctor friends have even more to say about anyone who dares to have a clinical autism diagnosis while being able to do things that their own children and patients cannot.
They ran this article. Doctors with autism speak out against stigma. All right, so never mind the fact that neither of my children even understand what a doctor is. But, they use doctors with autism. And
in my line of work on the neurobehavioral unit over the 20 years that I've been in the field, autism still represents individuals who are very impaired and who are going to require significant supports for the rest of their life, will never live independently, earn a living wage, run for office, drive a car, do any of those things, and certainly not attend university. Just really bears no semblance to what autism was when it was initially described by Cantor, when it was studied in the 70s by Rutter, and all the research that we have on autism is not what currently people are terming autism, and that does do a disservice to those who have, more classic or more true forms of autism.
Do not dominate the conversation, because that is what bias is. And that's something that we don't talk about enough in this kind of articles like the Spectrum publishes. It is the bias. You are absolutely writing all these documents with the bias that autism is something that is just a difference. We need to start talking about bias and to make sure that that we share that with everyone. We need to have a conversation, and a civilized conversation, not when one of the parties is afraid to speak because being afraid of being your career destroyed, because that is the reality of things. People are afraid to talk.
I agree. People shouldn't be afraid of having their careers ruined for speaking about autism. That's why it would make the National Council on Severe Autism look like a legion of bullshit merchants if you, as a guest on their official podcast, said those words in response to an article that turned out to contain the reproduced termination letter of an autistic doctor that was instantly fired upon disclosure of their diagnosis. Because that would be so outlandishly obscene that there's no possible way that an autism advocacy not-for-profit would do something that fucking terrible.
Oh my God!
Wow, for people so afraid to talk, these three certainly have a lot to say. And I have a lot to say about everything they have to say. I think that makes for a good stopping point for part 1 of barrier aggression. Next time, I'll begin a detailed explication and criticism of select moments from the podcast episode, with some other material from the NCSA and from elsewhere, included here and there. Now, this was all nothing but an introduction to what I expect to be a long series. I hope you'll all join me. If you do come with me for this ride, please understand that I will be discussing upsetting topics including disability discrimination, gaslighting, and self-induced loss of life. Throughout this project, I will be trying to use descriptive language of disability more in line with what's used by the disability community, but I'll also be interchangeably using that with terms the NCSA uses and that the general public may be more familiar with, including high and low functioning autism labels and phrases like severe autism. If you can't handle that, these are not the videos for you. As you've seen already, all video footage used for commentary will be timestamped so that viewers could find moments in the original context and the original sources more easily. I added scrolling watermarks to make obvious when I've made cuts in the original videos because I don't intend to misrepresent anyone's ideas or words with my editing. The scrolling watermarks are, by my design, also intentionally annoying, and I deliberately reduced the sound quality a bit compared to the original videos, because if you want to watch the original videos and enjoy them, you need to find the links below and watch them on the original channels. It's really the only way to know for sure if I'm lying about the original videos or not, and I find it very important to make the original sources available and for people to judge them and make their own conclusions. You shouldn't trust someone on the internet just because they present themselves as a worm-infested cartoon dog. Now, some third-party video or audio will be altered for the purpose of the narrative that I'm building. I will explicitly announce when third-party material I'm commenting on has been altered from its original form, and I will, by the end of this series, be discussing it in its unaltered form and explaining its original source and context. Now, a document in the info box will provide links to all the video and audio sources and articles of the articles I've commented on, videos I've commented on, blog posts I've commented on. I encourage everyone once again to check the original sources and draw your own conclusions. I will try to have audio-free versions of each of these barrier aggression video parts so that for those who have maybe auditory processing issues and can better understand me and the people I'm criticizing or commenting on without the background music, I will try to provide links to those in the description to unlisted alternate versions of the videos for those who would benefit from that. And most importantly of all, I need you to understand that under no circumstances should anyone personally contact, sabotage, or disrupt the peace of the people I discussed in this video, regardless of their opinions, their affiliations, and regardless of if they may or may not arguably be considered a public figure. So with all that out the way, I'll be back later for part 2 of barrier aggression. Until then, I'll see you all next time, and thank you very much for watching.
Okay, open the door and let's take a swing at the motherfuckers.